Hi, my name's Steve Bartlett and welcome to Fight Back. Tonight's show is going to be a little bit different. I'm somebody who's got a reputation for loving controversy, and today I'm going to have a show and I think I might just piss everybody off. Not just the conservatives who I normally upset, but also a lot of my liberal friends might be upset with what I have to say today, because I'm going to talk about a lot of issues that haven't really been talked about. Basically, the show is going to start off about what's going on in Virginia. I'm talking about the problem with Blackface and the governor of Virginia, Ralph Northam. Now, for those of you who haven't heard what's going on there, the Democrat who is currently the governor of Virginia, in his high school yearbook book back in the 1980s, has a picture of him. Well, we think it's him. We're not really sure, but it's still on his page. One person's dressed up like a minstrel in blackface, standing next to somebody in the Ku Klux Klan. Now, supposedly it was a Halloween outfit. At first, he apologized for the picture, but then claimed he really wasn't the person in the picture, doesn't remember being in the picture or not. So we don't know whether he's in the Ku Klux Klan outfit or whether he's in the minstrel show outfit. We really can't tell, but it's still a very racist picture on his page in his yearbook. He claimed that the reason he was apologizing wasn't because of this picture, but because of a possible other picture of him who was also in blackface when he was supposedly dressed up like Michael Jackson doing the moonwalk in a Michael Jackson dance contest. So he said that that's what he thought they were referring to when they said a blackface, and that therefore he's not in this picture and therefore he shouldn't resign. Well, what happened is the liberals went absolutely crazy. They went absolutely crazy because they said this guy has to resign. He's wearing blackface. He's a racist. We can't have a racist governor in the state of Virginia. Actually, other liberals, a lot of African Americans said, well, we actually kind of like him in the state of Virginia. So the Democrats amongst themselves are actually fighting amongst themselves. Some Democrats say let him stay governor. Others say he's got to resign immediately because he's a racist because of the picture that was taken back in the 1980s. Okay? Well, what happened is the person who's the lieutenant governor, who's an African-American gentleman, he's in a sex scandal, and he's accused of actually possibly raping a couple women. Now, with the Me Too movement, you know, that means someone's automatically guilty, and that's what Democrats said off with his head. Now, there's a big difference between the racial scandal and the alleged rape scandal, because one is a crime, the other one is not a crime. And therefore, if it's a crime, a person can be impeached for any type of criminal activity, and you know, he hasn't been charged with any crimes, but that's a problem because the Democrats were saying, well, if we get rid of the one governor and the lieutenant governor, then who's going to be in charge? Well, it would be the next person in charge, who would also be a Democrat, but that Democrat also has a blackface scandal as well. So all the Republicans are happy, saying all three of them have to go. Why? Because the next person in line is a Republican, and therefore a Republican would take the place of the democratically elected officials who happen to be Democrats, causing a total mess. There's ideas of whether there's hypocrisy in the Democratic Party, saying if this were a Republican governor, all the Democrats would be saying off with his head. So there's a lot of issues here in place, besides just the issue as to whether or not the governor should stay in power or not in the state of Virginia. Okay? And these issues are dealing with complicated questions that I've been thinking about for several weeks now. Like, well, is blackface really wrong? Is it always wrong? What is the definition of racism? Can a person have racial beliefs without actually being a racist, and other things that are very complicated. And I want to talk about some of these controversial issues tonight. I might not have the right answers, but at least I think we should be having the conversation and raising some of these issues. So if you want to call and talk about some of these issues, we have a phone number. I think it's going to flash on the screen if you wish to give a call, or if you just want to text or just want to watch the show, be my guest. But there's a lot of things I want to talk to you about tonight, okay? So let's talk about blackface itself. Now, blackface is highly offensive to the African American community, as it should. At least blackface is understood by the concept of a minstrel show. Minstrel shows started out as entertainment in the 19th century before the Civil War, and they were highly offensive because people would dress up as African Americans, and they would have blackface, and they would have exaggerated lips, and all the bad stereotypes of African Americans were perpetuated by these minstrel shows. Black people were perceived as being buffoons and lazy and stupid and criminals and being extra sexual, and it was completely offensive. Every poor stereotype that a black person could have, these minstrel shows actually encouraged and just ridiculed the African American community. And these minstrel shows, even though they started around the 1840s, they did not leave society for a very long time. Even in the 20th century, minstrel shows were still going on, especially in the South. What was even more offensive than white people dressing up like African Americans with the black face and the big lips was that African Americans were actually forced to perform in minstrel shows, and black people had to paint their face black, which was even more offensive, that they said, okay, you're black, but we're going to make you even a blacker stereotype. And because of this, there has been outrage with the African American community about the insensitivity of this perpetuated stereotypes of how, even though we're in the 21st century, that people are still subjecting African Americans to the concept of a minstrel show. And this wasn't just something that happened in the 19th century. I mean, American culture, the 20th century, is filled with blackface. Al Jolson, the biggest movie of all time, the Titanic or the Avatar, the Star Wars, of the 1920s, was a movie called The Jazz Singer, in which for the very first time there was sound in the movie, and Al Jolson wore blackface and sang standard songs from the 1920s. And it was a huge hit. It was considered to be part of American society, blackface. The truth is, American culture has a very racist history. And it's wrong for Americans to pretend now that this racism never existed. Okay, in the 1940s, one of the biggest radio shows of the 40s and the 1950s was a show called Amos and Andy, in which two white guys wore blackface and pretended to be African Americans and perpetuate the same racial stereotypes as the minstrel shows. And this show not only was a big hit on the radio, but in the 1950s, it was a television show, which was a big hit. Mainstream America through the 1950s still embraced this racism, and this casual racism was in the movies. Major movie stars who we all love and adore, who've won awards, wore blackface in their career. Bing Crosby, the biggest selling musical artist before Elvis and the Beatles, wore blackface. Fred Astaire, the epitome of class in all the musicals in the 1930s and 40s and 50s, he also wore blackface. So did little Shirley Temple. Laurel and Hardy, the stand-up comedians, the famous duo. The Three Stooges even did blackface. Mickey Rooney did blackface. Even Bugs Bunny of Warner did blackface. There's a lot of cartoons that were completely racist that came out in the 1940s that now they don't show them anymore for obvious reasons, that they don't want to offend the African American community. But we cannot pretend that we have a history of racism in this country, and we need to talk about it. And, okay, so we're going back to before I was born. But you know what? This existed even after I was born, this racial stereotypes and blackface, okay? Now, the pictures of Mr. Northam took place in the 1980s, and they said, well, back in the 1980s, everyone knew that blackface was wrong, that minstrel shows no longer exist, and no one should ever do blackface in the 1980s. Well, there was a video by Culture Club with Boy George called Do You Really Want to Hurt Me? And in that video, they had a jury, and all the members of the jury wore blackface. And this was in the 1980s. Ted Danson, about 10 years ago when he was dating Whoopi Goldberg, showed up at a roast, and he was wearing blackface, highly offensive. So this isn't something that just existed in the bygone era, but has actually been embraced by American culture at all different levels throughout the 19th and 20th century. Most offensive of all. Okay, a lot of people don't know this. This hasn't been sent on the news at all, but Ben Vereen, the great actor, the African-American actor who starred in Roots, played Chicken George in Roots, and won the Tony for some, I think, Pippin on Broadway, and was a big favorite of Bob Fosse. Okay, he performed in blackface in Washington, D.C. in 1981. And you're sitting there going, well, what's the big deal about that? Well, where did he perform blackface? He performed at the gala for President Ronald Reagan's inauguration. That was considered to be appropriate behavior, appropriate entertainment in the 80s. For the President of the United States, the beloved Ronald Reagan, he was sitting there watching and enjoying blackface for his entertainment. Okay? So we have this history of racism in our country. Okay? And it's understandable why African Americans are offended by this perpetuation of stereotypes of minstrel shows. It's absolutely horrible. But our whole society is full of this hypocrisy, okay? So the state of Florida, its state song in the state of Florida is by a guy named Stephen Foster. And a lot of Stephen Foster's songs were actually sung and became popular during the minstrel shows of the 19th century, okay? But the state song in Florida is a song called The Old Folks of Home, which most people call Way Down Upon the Swanee River. That's the song. Way Down Upon the Swanee River. Classic song, state song of Florida. Personally, I think they should change it to Freebird by Leonard Skinner, who are from Jacksonville, but we can go there at another time. But here's the lyrics that are very rarely sung in the song by Stephen Foster, the official state song of Florida. And the words are, all the world is sad and dreary, everywhere I roam. Oh, darkies, how my heart grows weary. Talking about African Americans, referring to them as darkies, pining for the old days of before the Civil War. Okay, that's the state song of Florida. Okay, and as we know, Washington, the father of our country, owned slaves. Thomas Jefferson owned slaves. Many of our presidents, many of our congressmen were racist. Our country has a huge history of racism. But the big question is, should Northam resign? Should he resign? Should the governor of Virginia resign? Who's right? Is it right for the Democrats who say, well, you know, he's a Democrat, we don't want a Republican in there because they'll be worse? Or is it better to be pure and say, no, if you do something racist, even if it is in your past, even if it's 20 years ago, it's so offensive to African Americans, he's got to resign. We got to clean house. Well, it's not that easy of a question, okay? Because the truth is, a lot of the things that the governor of Virginia stands for are very good things. And let me talk about some of the things that he actually believes in that progressives and liberals and the African American community would actually like that he does as the governor of Virginia. He was for and an advocate for tearing down the monuments of the Confederate soldiers that have been so prominently displayed in Virginia and placing them in museums because they actually are offensive to so many members of the African American community. That's what he's for. He opposes the death penalty, which every liberal in America will tell you is administered against African Americans more than it is against white people in a discriminatory, racist way. He's against the death penalty. He is opposed to a right-to-work amendment in Virginia Constitution, which would make it harder for people to unionize. And as everyone knows, right-to-work states mean anti-union states, and that's bad for the population, according to most liberals such as me. He supports the ability of the state to pay for free tuition for college, for community colleges for students, for young people in the state of Virginia. He's for decriminalizing marijuana, and as we know, there's so many people who are African American who are incarcerated right now due to drug crimes that are not violent. He's for ending the Virginia photo ID law, which liberals like myself agree are used in a racist way in order to disenfranchise African Americans at the polls. He's for campaign finance reform, which I've advocated for this on this show before. Is against he's for blocking donations from corporations into campaigns. He's for putting a cap on donations of $10,000. He's for making a law prohibiting the use of campaign funds by lawmakers. So he's got this huge progressive agenda. However, it's stained by this photograph from the 1980s in which he was wearing blackface. So the question is, should he get a pass? Should he be forgiven? Should he be judged not by who he was in the 80s, but who he is now? These are all important questions that I think we should decide before we all get on the bandwagon and say, let's run him out of town on a rail, or let's throw him a parade and celebrate, okay? Because the truth is, people are more complicated than just one or two things. You know, in some ways, Thomas Jefferson was a wonderful man. He wrote the Declaration of Independence and proclaimed, liberty and justice for all, and that it's self-evident that all men are created equal. But the man owned slaves. He owned slaves at the same time he was talking about the principles that made America great. So people are complex. The same way Jefferson was both a hero and a villain and a very complicated man, people today are the same way, but it's very easy with this gotcha mentality for people to want to ruin people's careers. People love it, especially the media. They just love to obsess about it. So I'm not saying whether or not right now Northam should stay or go, but I'm just saying it's a more complicated issue. Okay? And there's been a whole history of racism with our politicians, like I said. And, sometimes a racist politician may do something that does a lot of good, especially for the African American community. Here's an example, LBJ, Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson threw out the N-word on a regular basis back in the 1960s. However, when he was President of the United States, he passed the Civil Rights Act. He passed the Voting Rights Act. He voted and created the Medicare Act. Would African Americans have been better off with or without Johnson? As soon as it got published that he used the N-word, should he have resigned? Should he have been booted out of office? Would it have been better for us to not have the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965? Or is it better to have a sinner transcend his sins and actually do something positive? Hugo Black. A lot of you guys wouldn't know who Hugo Black is, but I'm a lawyer, and as a legal geek, he's one of the giants in the history of the Supreme Court. Most say he's one of the 5 most influential judges of all time. He served longer than pretty much every judge who ever lived on the Supreme Court. He was a former member of the Ku Klux Klan. Okay? He also has the sin of writing the decision, Korematsu, which allowed for Japanese Americans to be placed in concentration camps during World War II, one of the biggest stains in our history of our country. That's horrible. Should he have been impeached? Should he have been forced to resign from the Supreme Court? Maybe. But at the same time, Hugo Black wrote the Gideon decision, which said that everybody is entitled to have an attorney, and if you can't afford an attorney, the government would provide one for you. How many poor people, especially African Americans, were able to get legal representation when they would have been denied that but for that decision by Hugo Black? He also was part of the majority decision in Miranda, the famous case which says that anything that the police say, they have to read you your rights before they question you, or else the statements get thrown out of court. He also was part of the majority decision in Brown versus the Board of Education, which ended separate but equal and allowed the blacks and whites to be integrated in our schools, and basically the rest of society as well. Hugo Black was partially responsible for that. A member of the Ku Klux Klan, a known racist, transcended that racism and became something better. Let's talk about Robert Byrd. Robert Byrd was a Democrat who served in the United States Senate longer than any American in history. He was also a member of the Ku Klux Klan and was against the Civil Rights Act in 1964. However, he evolved, and by the time he left the Congress and retired, or did he die? I don't remember. I think he passed away. But before Robert Byrd was finished as a senator, he had changed, and he was getting 100% approvals by the NAACP and became actually a liberal, and who actually praised him when he left office by saying that he became a champion for civil rights and liberties. And he was a major supporter of the Martin Luther King holiday. and he thought of that as personal penance for the years that he was racist, because he grew as a person. And that's what the history of America is about, our growth as a country. We started out with some principles that were very high, but we were below them. At the same time we were talking about liberty and justice for all, we engaged in the institution of slavery. But we transcended that. As a country, we were on a path to enlightenment, and we became more enlightened. Now, unfortunately, after slavery, we still had Jim Crow, but eventually we overcame Jim Crow as well. And as we had the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and then we ended up electing an African-American president of the United States, Barack Obama. Does that mean that racism is over? Of course not. We still have a long way to go. But what it means is that America is constantly improving. We're just not resting on our laurels. We're trying to live up to our own ideals. So in order to learn from your mistake, you need to be forgiven. You need to forgive yourself first, and you need to ask for forgiveness from others. Now, maybe African Americans shouldn't forgive the governor of Virginia, but we should encourage him to attempt to try. We should encourage people who make a mistake to try to change their stripes and to learn from their mistakes. And then we can judge them, and then we can vote him out of office, or then we can impeach him, or do whatever we want to do, or call for their resignation. But people should be encouraged to try. And a person is not the same person that they were 20 years ago. People change. Now, a couple years ago, Al Franken did something. He was caught in a photograph of him holding his hands over a woman's breast. It seemed like it was a joke picture. He was smiling, and the woman, for whatever reason, was dressed up in full military garb, not like she was really sleeping. And they had done entertainment stuff before, and there was questions as to whether it was staged or whether it was real or not. And then he got accused of some sort of inappropriate touching of women. Anyway, the Me Too movement was at its full strength at that time, and all the liberals, and especially a lot of liberal females, called for his resignation from the Senate. Now, he was a very progressive senator who was strongly encouraging progressive and pro-woman type of legislation in the Senate. In fact, it was Al Franken who was responsible for the investigation going on against Donald Trump, because if you recall, it was Al Franken who caught the Attorney General lying in the Senate confirmation hearings, and that's the reason why he had to recuse himself from being in charge of the investigation of Russiagate, because he was proven by Al Franken to have lied about his own Jeff Sessions' own interactions with the Russians before the election, and that's what resulted in Sessions being recused, and now what's going on. So Al Franken was a hero to liberals, hero to progressives, but he was forced out. And the question is it wrong to force him out? Was it wrong to do this? I wrote a letter supporting his resignation, saying that a senator owes a higher standard than what Al Franken actually did, that he should resign because senators should be held to a higher standard. And therefore, even if there's any whiff of wrongdoing, it's a privilege to be an elected official, not a right. However, I realize now that I was wrong. And the reason why I was wrong is because it doesn't matter what I thought of Al Franken. It doesn't matter what I think of the governor of Virginia, because they were elected. They were elected democratically by their constituents, and only the constituents should be able to say what they did was wrong or right. They're not accused of crimes. They're accused of being insensitive and doing the wrong thing, but that's for the voters to decide. And if they resign, or they're kicked out of office, or forced into resignation, we're disenfranchising the electorate. We're telling the electorate that they do not have a right to decide for themselves who should be their leaders. And so I think if you don't like the governor of Virginia, maybe you should vote him out. Maybe you should get rid of him. But you voted him in, so he should not be forced by the liberal police or the PC police to leave, or by people who are working or protesting, but by the voters themselves. We cannot tell millions of people who voted for governor that your vote no longer counts because we are higher than what you guys wanted. The will of the people need to be respected, unless there's a crime. If the person commits a crime, then you impeach and kick him out. But if it's just offensive behavior, the will of the people should be paramount. And I was wrong about Al Franken. But People say, well, isn't that hypocritical? You guys were all against Brett Kavanaugh, but there was a difference. Brett Kavanaugh was not an elected official. He had no right. He was not entitled. The public did not make him on the Supreme Court. He hadn't gotten the job yet. So therefore, you can sit there and say any reason for not giving him the job. But once somebody has a job, they should only either be impeached for a crime or taken out of office by a new election. But there's other things that are more complicated as well, and I don't know if I have much time for it, so I'm going to talk quickly. But is blackface always racist? If a child wants to dress up, a white child wants to dress up as Black Panther for Halloween, is that wrong? Well, it depends on what the definition of racism is. Racism is the belief in the superiority of someone's own race. Okay? It's actually asking for there to be laws or cultural norms that actually discriminates against an individual because of their race. That's what racism is, not the belief, okay? So it's the actual actions. It's the belief of being superior and then oppressing somebody because of that mistaken belief of superiority. If you want to be a kid and dress up like Black Panther, you're not doing that in order to disrespect African Americans. You're not doing that because you feel superior to African Americans. You're trying to give them tribute. You're trying to say, I love Black Panther and I want to dress up like him for Halloween. And how do you tell a 5-year-old kid you can't dress up like your hero because white children can't get dressed up like black superheroes? You can only get dressed up like white superheroes. That rubs me the wrong way. If there's no intent to be disrespectful, if there's no intent to be racist, it's not racist. Was Billy Crystal racist when he dressed up like Sammy Davis Jr. on Saturday Night Live? Was Laurence Olivier, when he wore blackface playing Othello, was that racist? Was Fred Armisen racist when he was dressed up like Obama? Should all these people be forced to go away? It's the intent that what matters, okay? What matters is we have to talk about these issues. People in their nature have prejudiced feelings. We can't help it. We are by nature prejudiced to be more attracted to people like ourselves. Men are more aligned with men. Women are more aligned with women, okay? Black people, a lot of them feel more comfortable around other black people. It's understandable. Racism is when you believe you're superior and that other people should be treated inferior. And we need to overcome that. And the only way we can begin to overcome that is if we start having this dialogue. Okay? We have to realize who we are and we have to realize what we can be. Okay? I'm not asking for us to be colorblind. Okay? Because if you're colorblind and you pretend racism doesn't exist, that actually promotes systematic racism. What we need to do is we need to come together and we have to use common sense and we have to stop the gotcha mentality and do what the right thing is. See you next week.